Okay, we're live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest, a returning guest. His name is Phillip F. Nelson. And we talked back in November 24th, 2021, about his book, Who Really Killed Martin Luther King Jr., The Case Against Lyndon Baines Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover. And that book was published in 2018. And he's a very thorough researcher and goes in very much detail into this. So I invited him back to talk about his other book that he published in 2014. Title of that book that we're going to kind of cover today is LBJ, From Mastermind to the Colossus. And the subtitle is The Lies, Treachery, and Treasons Continues, published in 2014. Currently in the American Amazon, it has 47 five-star reviews. Phillip has also written other books about LBJ in that era of the 60s. One was titled LBJ The Mastermind of the JFK Assassination, 2013. Also, Remember the Liberty, Almost Sunk by Treason on the High Seas, May 19th, 2017. And Phillip F. Nelson's website is www.lbjthemasterofdeceit.com. And this book goes in great detail about many subjects and just why the 60s went back. And a lot of times I think this book clarifies a lot of the events that happened in the 60s, because oftentimes looking back, and we're going to talk about historiography, but looking back, you just see one event. You see maybe the attack on the U.S. Liberty, or Robert F. Kennedy, or the JFK assassination. But this book puts them all together, and you see LBJ involved in all these things. So, Phillip F. Nelson, welcome back to the show. Thanks for coming back on.
Well, thank you, William.
So for people, awesome. Well, for some people who may not have heard our last interview, can you kind of talk about your background and why you got interested in the subject of LBJ and all the stuff, shenanigans he was involved in?
Yes, I'd be glad to. I guess it all started at the point where I was coming of age, so to speak. And I'm referring to about 1960. In 1960, I was 15 years old for 11 and a half months, and then I turned 16 in the middle of December. So you might say I was just 15 years old. And I took an interest in the national election, the presidential election that year, because of the interesting contrast between the exiting President Eisenhower and the election of John F. Kennedy, to replace him. And you couldn't get much more of a contrast than that. Well, that's what I guess started my interest in the political world, as well as the fact I should acknowledge that my father had always been interested in that area as well. And he used to use some words that I didn't know what they meant. And once I remember him using the word propaganda, and I had never heard that word before, so I asked him what it meant. And he explained it to me, and pretty much what we all understand is the common definition of that term. And I started paying attention more as to what politicians said. And I began having doubts here and there, and it was just something that interested me, how two different, or one event can be explained so differently by two different sides. Well, in 1961, I believe I was a sophomore in high school, and there was an announcement on the third Monday of February, as I recall. It was the third Monday. And it was announcing the fact that there was an airplane crash on the new vice president's ranch. I thought that was strange. Even the guy's got an airfield right on a runway right on his property. And yes, that was true. And as we found out later, among many other things, he had constructed that with government money, government funds, even back when he was not even the vice president, before that, when he was in the Senate. And, strange how that worked out. But anyway, this announcement was about an airplane crash on his ranch. at the end of it, the announcer said, but it's okay. The vice president was not on board the plane, and of course he was not heard, therefore, and so everything is okay there. But the fact of the matter, there were 2 pilots killed in that airplane crash on his ranch at his behest, basically, because he insisted that they land an airplane, a 2-engine, it was called a Convair 240, I think it was, propeller-driven engine. Those airplanes could hold about 25 or 30 people as well. But that was a fairly large airplane. It's something along the lines of a little more sophisticated, a little larger than a DC-3. Well, anyway, they tried to land that airplane, but there were no instruments on that airfield. And the fog was such that they couldn't see. It was very limited visibility. He insisted they land the airplane, though, and they did. They tried to, but in the process, they crashed into a cedar tree grove on a hill just beyond the start of the runway. And that sort of got buried, not only then, because it took them 4 days to make this announcement. That's what puzzled me the most. What if this happened, last week, what's it coming out now for? And that was just the beginning of the mysteries, and they deepened and deepened, but most of the country didn't see all these articles that were written in newspapers down in Texas, so they weren't aware of it. But anyway, in 1964, all of that was brought out, and the people were brought up to date. That is, whoever might have read the book by J. Evans Haley, A Texan Looks at Linden, because there he explained all of that and all the background, and there's all the confusion that went on about who owned the plane even and what went on. But there was testimony from 2 men in the aircraft control tower who had been communicating with those pilots, and so they came forward, and a lot of the information came out that it was Johnson who insisted that they land that airplane, and he used the phrase something along the lines of, "What do you think I'm paying you for? It's your job to do this." Well, had he been on that airplane, that he would have never pressed him like that.
Right.
Anyway, this is the mindset, though. This is what I was gradually learning about during those early years, and for some reason, I just always thought from that moment on that there was something very evil about this fellow. And I believe that over the years, I've studied him enough to come to the conclusion that he really was a psychopath. He was a sociopath, a narcissist. He was bipolar. He had all kinds of things going on in his head that, when combined in the aggregate, made him just one evil SOB.
Right.
And anyway, that's how it all started.
And lethal too. So, but his career, like you write in your book, and it's a recurring theme, like he really thought to become president was his destiny from a very early age, right?
Yes, right. He felt that strongly, and we know of that because Robert Caro's first book, which was a very interesting and well done, well researched book, that he even stated that when he was 12 years old, and he also, further explained that it didn't just start there. That he somehow, when he was very young, decided that he wanted to be president of the United States. It was probably related to the fact that his father had taken him into the Texas legislature down there in Austin. He had been a representative. I'm not sure what are the term. I guess just legislator. And Lyndon would follow him around, and other state senators would say something like that. They would refer to Lyndon Johnson as a child as Sam Jr. or something like that, because he mimicked his father. And anyway, that's That was just
So it started young, and you said his grandmother said that he had deceptive traits from a very young age, like five years old or something like
yeah,
that. Like they saw
right.
it early. Yeah.
Yeah, and in fact, his grandmother, uh, I believe, was the grandmother on the father's side too. Stated that boy will wind up in a penitentiary. She was just certain of it. That boy's going to wind up in a penitentiary, and he would have, had he had not had so much power over the entire state of Texas legislative and judicial and law enforcement agencies. That's how strong his power was throughout Texas.
Right.
And
And then he really developed that from an early age. I found it really fascinating. Like he had this whole mythology surrounding himself that his ancestors fought at the Alamo or San Jacinto, which didn't, that's what he told other people to bolster himself. And it started very young. And he went to kind of a teacher school, right? Where it almost like there was almost like that was the fight that he had with the Kennedys almost took place at that teacher school. You talk about the White Stars and the Black Stars. Can you talk about that?
oh well, yeah, he uh, somehow decided that he was going to take over control of the whole student body, and even though he was not particularly popular among the so-called in crowd, he got to be very popular with other people who sort of followed him and were led by him into something called the White Stars. In other words, the Black Stars or was it the White Stars that were the good guys, or the strongly, I guess, fraternity based students, and then the other ones were not, and they were the sort of called the out crowd, like in crowd and out crowd and so forth. And anyway, he managed to influence a lot of his contemporaries to support him by helping him cheat in the election. And so he basically cheated his way into being elected into the president of the student body.
Right.
And he used that, and that's when he started learning about how to exercise the power to try to have people do some, well, not so polite or not so legal and ethical things, to support him in his quest for this power.
And I think what you mentioned in the book is a lot. He told those this was the beginnings of his secrecy. So he had this group that they weren't supposed to acknowledge to anybody else that they were together, that they were would go out and do things independently, vote twice, three times, but nobody else was ever supposed to know that Johnson was the kingpin, right, or the mastermind.
Right.
So,
And I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, I think that's very important. So you see that genesis, the beginnings of that, how he would use that technique or that approach all the way through his life, his political life.
Yes. Well, he created all kinds of rules that they had to abide by, and among them was a rule that no three of them could ever be seen anywhere on the campus in a discussion. No, that is maybe two, but that's it. Not a third, not a fourth, of course. And if three showed up at any place at the same time, through and silently, not through verbal expressions, but through eye contact and through shaking of the head and or whatever, that they were to decide which of the three had to leave. and that was what he put into place. And that's just a simple but sort of humorous example of those kinds of rules. But he had control over that entire campus. It was quite a feat, and he bragged about it for years. Even in his last interviews, he went back and harkened back to those days about how what a great success he had in breaking the White Stars. He said, and they got broke for a long time, is what he said.
That's right, yeah. Like he was glad about breaking them, even through surreptitious, unethical means. He was happy. And I kind of saw that duality of them being like the popular kids and him kind of not being as popular. So I kind of saw them counterpoise. Maybe I've got the Kennedys, that was like a future thing, like that duality or dichotomy played itself out in future contests that LBJ had. But I thought that was interesting. And like his family, like you wrote, I think in the intro, like there was something in the Kinsey report about LBJ. Can you talk about that?
Yes, there was a fellow down in Houston named Ray Hill. He's now deceased, but when I wrote the book, he was still alive, and I got the story straight from him. And he had, as a student back in the 40s, had been a student at IU in Bloomington, Indiana, and that's exactly the same town that the Kinsey Institute was founded at and run from. And so he got himself a job there, a part-time job, doing clerical work. But that clerical work was for one of the top senior officials. I can't remember his name right now, but he was a senior official there. And that access got him into, all the libraries and all of the source materials and so forth that they were publishing. All the information they were publishing for people who haven't heard of this Kinsey Institute. It was formed by a guy named Alfred Kinsey, and it was basically for the study of human sexual wanderings or whatever. It was both male and female and combinations thereof. And he came out with some startling stuff in the late 40s, early 50s. Things that really shook a lot of people because there was he explored all kinds of things that were normally not practiced by most people. And anyway, that led this fellow into looking at some of the actual interviews of people that the Kinseys and their assistants, whomever, interviewed. And he knew the filing system. He was a clerk. He was a file clerk, so he knew all about how all this stuff was filed. And he figured out how to reinterpret it so that he could go look at a file and figure out who the interview was with, even though that name was never really spelled out. It was coded, like every other letter of the person's name would be spelled, and it might have even been backwards or something like that. It was just a code, a fairly simple code to break. And he found the interview that they had with Lyndon Johnson, and in that interview, Lyndon Johnson acknowledged that he had intercourse with his grandmother
when he was 14. Yeah, I mean and that was the beginning of his weird kind of life. I mean, he had very curious appetites, right?
Well, yes, and it should be mentioned also, and without any indication of this being factual. This is just a thought that is generated by that business that we just discussed, and it wasn't perhaps just his grandmother that he was having this relationship with, because he was very, very close to his mother, closer than, well, if you read any of the major biographies, Caro, Dalek, so on, Doris Kearns Goodwin, that comes through.
Wow, that's amazing. And Doris Kearns Goodwin, you talk about in the book, and I think she's still around and she's still talking about history. She was possibly one of LBJ's mistresses too, so you got to consider that source, right?
Well, yes. In fact, I've written a blog about that very point, a very lengthy blog that is more detailed than what you would find in the book. In fact, what's in the book is a couple of paragraphs compared to what I put in that blog. And that blog can be found on my website /blog called LBJ The Master of Deceit. And I think that one was about, if you scroll down the blogs go down to I think it was like 2019. It was very early on, sometime during 2019.
Gotcha.
But
We can put that up if you want. Let's put up here.
now I could be 2020, but anyway, it's a couple of years ago now.
Right. So you have more information about this that's not in the book, is what you said.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
It does go into considerable more detail. Well, actually, there it is right there, isn't it? Okay. So that's recent right there.
Right. So these are the reasons you're blogging very frequently too, so people can go check all this stuff out. But it kind of goes George Goodwin, Kearns, and Caro. Like you talk a lot about in your book, like how important it is for history. I mean, you make statements like, you don't want to have the history to be distilled, decaffeinated, homogenized, pasteurized, heavily sweetened. Because Caro excises a lot of these stories out and a lot of these people out of his biographies, and he's supposed to be the biographer of record, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's an interesting point that you made there. I've written more about that in the blogs as well, about the more details about how he's specifically avoided certain truths. Now, I touched upon that in I think it was this book. I think it probably was a little of that in both books, both of the first two. That is, the Mastermind book was the first. The Colossus book we're here to discuss was the second. And I think there's more in the second book about that than there was in the first. But the blog, I think, even takes it even a step further.
Gotcha. So there's issues with history. There's issues there, but he also had like illegitimate children, or possibly illegitimate children, and lots of different mistresses that he called a harem, right?
Well, yes, he did.
Can you talk about that?
He had secretary that at one point it was reported, and I'm not sure who the author was, but I remember it was reported that of 8 secretaries that he had, he was having relations with 5 of them, and I think I can tell you the ones that were not. So it means all the rest. But anyway, I'm not sure if we need to go that level of detail here.
Well, I mean, it's just more interesting. I'm just kind of laying the foundation of his personality, because once we get into the events, you can kind of see it. So he smoked a lot, he drank a lot, he was a heavy. Like they said, he could drink 2/5 at night. He could drink himself into a stupor for days.
Yeah.
So you kind of see kind of the mania, like driving fast and drinking alcohol in Texas. Real kind of wild man. And I mean, you said in your book, you said some people thought of him who knew him, like some people who are still around today. What's his name? Not what's his name?
Moyers.
Moyers. Yeah, said he was like an animal.
Yeah.
Right? Moyers said he ate like an animal and acted like a carnal animal.
Yeah. And even worse was what Horace Busby wrote in his memoirs. And there were others that George Reedy, and I can't think of all of them now, but a number of people who worked with him closely did write books about that, all except for, guess who? Bill Moyers. He didn't. And there's a reason for that. I'm not going to speculate about what it is, but it is.
But it's interesting because he's kind of this old wise man who, talks about myth and stuff like that. And here he is, in my opinion, kind of maintaining a myth about LBJ. Would you agree with that?
Well, I do. And I just think that he probably carries quite a burden, actually. So I sort of feel sorry for him, frankly, because he was LBJ's top guy, in 1960, late 64, into 65, 66. And then something happened and he left the White House. And it's never been clear about whether he quit or he was fired. And the same thing happened to McNamara. No one really knows. Did he resign or did he get fired? And I think it was a combination of both. And I think that he would have been fired if he didn't leave in both cases. But consider that that Bill Moyers he came to Washington to work for Lyndon Johnson back in mid 50s. I want to say 1956 or something like that. And he came there for the purpose. And this comes from one of Johnson's cronies down in Texas, the guy by the name of Harry Province, who was the publisher of the Waco newspaper, the major newspaper, whatever it was, in Waco. Because Johnson had asked him to be on the lookout for someone who might be able to come up and work for him, and he wanted him to try to pick someone from either that college, that seminary that Moyers had just graduated from, or some other kind of thing, religious kind of thing, for some reason. Well, anyway, I want to go into some detail in a future blog about this point, because it really touches on a lot of things that explain so much about how he was able. He had the natural talents of a PhD psychiatrist, I think, in evaluating people and men, and he could categorize them. And he would. He knew every character trait of every senator in the Senate when he was the master of the Senate, and he knew exactly where to touch them, what buttons to push, what motivation, what carrot, what stick to use to motivate any particular one of these 100 senators to, let him have his way. And it was often through bribes and chicanery and threats. He used every trick in the book. He knew how to get votes together, because a lot of that came from the fact that he was such great friends with J. Edgar Hoover. They lived right across the street, and Hoover let him see any of the files on any of the senators or congressmen or anybody else, the judges and whomever, that he wanted to see. And Hoover had files on all of them. And he had a lot of that stuff was innuendo and gossip from, people. It wasn't very filtered. That is, it was basically geared toward all the negatives.
Right, the salacious stuff, all of the kinks and weird stuff, yeah.
Right.
So he knew all that stuff, and that was probably why he got Moyers, because Moyers externally was this religious guy, right? So he could put a good spin on what LBJ was really doing. Would you agree?
That's exactly right. As a matter of fact, it was the purpose of that had to do with Johnson wanted a guy with who could be trusted, not to mess with his girlfriends, his mistresses, but actually in this case to actually guide one around Washington, act as what they called her beard. In other words, to go to functions, social functions, accompanying her, simply so that she would be available for him afterwards. Okay, and that was a lady named Mary Margaret Wiley, and this fellow Jack Valenti, who has quite a background also. That's a whole other subject, believe me.
No, but it's kind of important because he came out of Texas, so you see LBJ farming for people from his home state, and using them in certain environments. So Valenti comes up from an advertising agency in Houston, and then gets basically set up for the rest of his life to work in Hollywood, right? And
exactly.
He was in Hollywood for 4 decades, like forever.
Exactly. He was groomed by Johnson, and with the help of Lew Wasserman out there, who was a big-time movie mogul, among others, basically facilitated that. So it was all worked out, and basically Johnson had Wasserman make sure that he was hired for that position, so that he would be in a position for a long time. He was a young man at the time, and he would be in that position for many years. And in fact, it was around 40 years, I think, that he was out there in charge of the Motion Picture Academy, or whatever it's called. and it worked. There were many cases I've cited in the book, at least 2 or 3 specifics, where it was basically Jack Valenti who killed different initiatives by movie producers to dig into Johnson's past. He did not want that done. He wanted that to be shut up ASAP, and that's what got done.
Right, and
And
Valenti wrote like a real positive, bio of LBJ. So he carried, and I think he married one of LBJ's mistresses too, which
that was that same girl. Is that same
right.
one?
So he ends up marrying her, and it just shows that this trait of Johnson, the mastermind, the puppeteer,
Well,
played
the other
out in
catch
real
is
world stuff.
the other catch that's related to that is that yes, he set that whole thing up, but that it was always rumored though that the Jack Valenti was a homosexual.
Oh,
Okay. Oh yeah, it was. After all, he was like 44 or something, something like that when he married her, and that was an arranged setup. And in fact, Ron Kessler, in his book, one of his many books, referenced that very point, but by saying that one of Johnson's mistresses, that they were so close and so for so long, and that when she got married, her husband continued to allow her to be, go out with Johnson whenever he would.
Right.
And there had to be this one. Now, that same thing might have happened, also occurred with another couple or so. I don't know, but I know specifically, I don't know this. I have to say that the odds are that was the one that he was referencing, even because he didn't name them.
See, so I mean, that's just one. The Valenti and all these other characters is just another example. And one of the things your book shows is his ties to Wasserman and some of these other characters. He was a well-known associated with a lot of people who were in Hollywood, which I wasn't aware of before he became even vice president, right?
Yes. Well, he started becoming very close to them when he became vice president. But even before that, though, when he was in the Navy, he and John Connolly got themselves partnered up and made lieutenant colonels or lieutenant, well, whatever they are in the Navy, commanders, I guess. And their first assignment, so to speak, was to go up and down the West Coast and check facilities, to make sure everything, all the it's a well-oiled machine kind of thing, and they had no experience in this at all. They were politicians both,
Right.
and so there was kind of a gravy assignment, but he had promised his the Texas voters that he would go out there and get on the front lines or something.
Front lines, right? I mean, he got some kind of sketchy Silver Star too. Got some award going out, so that's also kind of a mysterious, suspicious event.
Yeah, he got himself out there for about a month, maybe 5 weeks or something like that, and wound up taking this 20-minute airplane ride, in which case, and when it got mechanical problems, it had to turn back after 13 minutes. It had to turn back and land. That's all that happened. Yet he got a Silver Star for that, and because he went out and stated publicly, he was talking about this in speeches and so forth, and he had authors convinced that he had done this, and so they wrote books about it. In 1964, there was a book written about Johnson's being a hero out there. Interestingly, the very same year that he was running for president, so he had that orchestrated too. But it was all a lie. It was trying to show that the reason the airplane had to turn around and go back was that it got shot up, and he bravely stood up in the bubble, in one of those bombers or fighter jets. Those are called a Marauder, but it had one of those plastic bubbles, and he stood up. Well, he did not stand up. The people who were there who I'm referencing in my book, basically said that none of that happened, none of it. And they were very upset about it because he got a Silver Star on that mission, and they flew dozens of missions, dozens of much more frightening and dangerous missions, and they never got a Silver Star. So it was, this stuff just starts tumbling out like socks out of a dryer after a while.
Right. You realize that all these stories are just a deceit, right? Master of deceit, just like the title says. I mean, just constant prevarication and things like that, and lies about it, mythologizing and doing stuff like that. I mean, can you talk about his coming up in Texas? I mean, it's shocking to think that so many people died around him and suicides, the quote, suicide, unquote. Can you talk about Mac Wallace and some of these other, I mean, I guess the earliest death that I thought was 1951 about the guy with the miniature golf course. Can you talk about that?
Yes. He you're talking about Doug Kinzer now.
Doug Kinzer, yeah.
And he was a golf pro. He had been in the military in World War II and came out with his brother. They opened a little, what they called pitch and putt golf course. Something like a par 3, but it was even probably smaller in terms of the yardage. But anyway, they opened this thing, and it was kind of on a shoestring budget, and they were always pressed for cash, for operating expenses and so forth. So anyway, what happened? That point though got lodged in his relationship to one of his girlfriends, and this girlfriend happened to be Lyndon Johnson's sister. Her name was Josepha, and the thing that he was trying to somehow get her to do, Josepha to do, was to convince her brother, who was then a senator. He was elected. No, he stole the election of 1948. So as of 1949, he went to Washington as a senator. And so this was just a year or two after that, in 1951. Things were getting a little out of hand with his sister, Josepha, down in Austin. She was dating this guy, and also there was also another woman involved. So there was what they call a menage a trois was going on down there, and in public in what is called Zilker Park. If you've ever been to Austin, it's just over the river, right on the river edge, on the other side of the river from downtown Austin. But anyway, so Mac Wallace, who had met Josepha during the campaign of 1948, she had come to Washington to try to help her brother and so forth. But Josepha was a party animal. She was a party girl, and so she liked socializing, in the extreme. Anyway, so he winds up meeting her and also Mac Wallace's wife. So he's got this affair going between Mac Wallace's wife and Lyndon Johnson's sister. And it's, as I said, it's a concurrent thing. And so they would sometimes be discovered over in Zilker Park, parked in a car, the three of them, doing whatever they were doing. And it got around. The stories were starting to get out about all this, and it was upsetting to all of both Mac and Lyndon. Well, Lyndon, and none of this is recorded. There's no paper documents, but you can tell by what happened. If you go backwards into what actually transpired as a result of all this, well, then it's pretty obvious what happened, and that was that Mac was sent to Austin with marching orders to eliminate this problem. And whatever words were spoken, we'll never know. But what actually happened was Mac Wallace went down there, picked up a gun from a person, a friend of his from his military days, who got to be an FBI agent. Joe shot I think was his name. Anyway, they he went to Austin, and after a few days of going back and forth, to try to meet and talk with his mother-in-law and his ex-wife and so forth, or I guess she was still his wife then. Well, and anyway, he wound up going down to that golf course, walked into the pro shop, pulled out his gun, and shot Doug Kinzer, I think 4 or 5 times it was. And then he sort of calmly tried to be calm, but walked back to his car. And his car was very recognizable because it had Virginia tags on it. Here it was, 1949, Austin, Texas. And this Virginia tagged 1939 blue Pontiac. So the car was 10 years old. It seems that he got to the impression or the reputation for always driving 10-year-old cars for whatever reason. And that was the first such illustration of that. Anyway, so all these people playing golf or hanging around the clubhouse saw him leave, and they saw him getting in this car, and they took the license number down. They called the police, and within an hour or so, they had arrested him. And he was very stoic about the whole thing and not too worried. The whole time he was arrested and so forth, and the reason was he knew that Johnson had the power to take care of this, and he did.
And he did, right.
And so the prosecutor and the defense attorneys, and at least one sinker on the jury, they found out later, that had all been corrupted in one way or the other to throw this trial. Well, it got to be the point to a situation where the jury did agree that they would find him guilty of murder with malice aforethought, which is first-degree murder. But then they were going to recommend that the judge suspend the sentence. Okay, whatever the sentence, you give him a minimal sentence and then suspend it. And so that's what happened. It got suspended, and
right, that's ridiculous. He had a 5-year suspended sentence, right?
Yeah.
And he's an interesting story because Malcolm Wallace is around Johnson for a long period of time. And you said in your book they farmed him out of the Friars Club, right? So he kind of comes from a secret society background. Would you agree with that?
Oh yeah, he was. I'm not so sure of that. I mean, but he was. Mac Wallace had been the president of the University of Texas Austin student union, and he was like the big guy on campus. He was an econ major, and he was pretty smart as far as that goes. But he was also evidently and obviously also a sociopath, and that is a person without a conscience. And if you have no conscience, then you can't really do something to embarrass yourself, or to even feel empathy or guilt for anything. That's the situation if you're one of those. And that's evidently what he was, because he shot the guy and just ambled off to his Pontiac, got in, drove off, was arrested, went through the whole trial thing, and didn't bat an eye. And even at the trial, when they gave the verdict, he was described. And a recent blog of mine also, I went through this. That is, I copied that piece of it. When I say recent, I'm not sure of how recent, but I should have all these memorized, I guess. But there's a couple hundred of them, so I hadn't done that. But anyway, I started out the whole blog on that one with a rendition of that article, because it got across to the fact that he was not concerned at all about it. In fact, when when they finally got to the point where he was found guilty, and then he was put on a suspended sentence, he cracked a smile finally.
Right. Is that you? Is that the one you're talking about? Reframing history with more myths, Mellon's fasting barn?
Yeah, in that section down there in the black background, right there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Shall I read it? Or?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. 30-year-old Mac Wallace stared intently at each of the 12 jurors as they filed into the still as a tomb courtroom. As the solemn-faced men, weary from 9 days of confinement and strain, took their seats in the jury box for the last time, bright sunlight flashed from Wallace's dark, horn-rimmed glasses. If there was tension within him when court clerk Pearl Smith cleared her throat to read the verdict, Wallace kept it out of sight. No trace of feeling creased his face as the clerk read the verdict of the jury, guilty of murder with malice in the October gunslaying of golf professional Doug Kinser. Still no expression when the sentence was read. 5 years in the state penitentiary. Then came the recommendation, suspended sentence, and for a fleeting moment, Wallace's mask broke, and a faint smile played across the corners of his mouth. Judge Charles O. Betts had warned that there would be no demonstration of any kind when the verdict was read. There was none, only a low hum in the half-filled. I'm sorry, it's such a small print. But anyway, that was in the Austin newspaper that morning, or that ad, whatever it was. The Austin, there it was in the caption. But that was the point I was trying to get across. That he just had no concern. He knew that Johnson was there. In fact, Johnson spent that whole period of time locked up in a hotel room down the block from where the trial was going on, and he had runners going back and forth all day, telling him, summarizing what was going on in the courtroom, because he didn't want to show his face there, of course. But he wanted to be there to control it. He wanted to make sure that it got done. Sure enough, it did.
And Mac Wallace is an important part of the story because he continues on. And I think this article is about your conflict with Joan Mellon, who said that he wasn't involved in November 22nd, 63, right?
Yeah, well, she has maintained all this time. I mean, she's written a number of books and always maintained that Johnson was not involved, didn't even have prior knowledge, and that's what she stood on all this time. Well, she tried to vindicate Mac Wallace and tried to exonerate Johnson. You know that her book in this blog, it's just a continuation of that, and for her to basically base all of that on the opinions and the memories of his children and his brothers and the rest of the family is a little transparently weak to me.
I mean, because there is an argument, right? So everybody goes back to JFK, and it's either Dulles, like you call in your book, is that you lay out why the central figure you believe is LBJ, not Dulles or intel agencies or some external, somebody other than somebody in Texas. Like the person who owned Texas at that time was Johnson, right?
Right. Yeah. And I felt that his power that he had accumulated down there over the years and played out there in 1963, and how he managed to redirect everyone's attention, and that's all it was about for that first year, especially the passage of all the first of the Great Society programs, the Vietnam War. He wanted everybody to be thinking about that stuff, not going over and rehashing all that stuff down in Dallas.
Right.
And I think all that sort of goes in hand. But in the book that we're talking about, I'm referring to the Colossus book that was published in 2014 now, LBJ from Mastermind to the Colossus. Most of it follows the assassination. See, because the first book, The Mastermind, that was all about the assassination. So now in this book, we're talking mostly about what he did during his administration. About 85% of the book, starting with chapter 2, is all about that. However, that first chapter, the first chapter was called The Real Lone Ranger. It was all about Captain Clint Peoples. And
most people would not know his name. Could you say who Clint Peoples was?
Oh, yeah, sure. I would love to, because it turns out that Captain Clint Peoples had been convinced of something, a lot of criminal activity on the part of Johnson's part for a long time. Let's just leave it at that for now. But I'll pack in some details here, though. He had been let's back up a second. Ultimately, he became, if not the most, one of the most celebrated and honored of the Texas Rangers of all time. All the honors that you can get, he was accumulating. In fact, they used him as the model for that Texas Ranger who's in the lobby, the downstairs lobby when you enter the Love Field passenger terminal. There's this huge statue, and he was the model for that.
Interesting. And there's a picture of him from your book right there on horseback.
Yeah, right. That's when he was on probably at a county fair or something like that. And that's 1960, because there's a 1960 Ford in the background and 1960 Chevy station wagon on the other side. So it had to be in that 1960 or 61 era. But anyway, he was picked by the head of the Texas Rangers to investigate a murder of Henry Marshall. He was appointed in 1962, but the murder happened a year before that. That was in 1961.
Right. When LBJ is in office as vice president, right? Yes,
LBJ is in office. He's got this associate down there in West Texas named Billy Solestis, and together they worked out a whole series of frauds against the federal government. Okay, and because Johnson was in such a position that he knew how they should be set up in order to get around, these petty rules and regulations that he himself helped write. So there was just this story can get very complex, but that's the essentials of it. The two of them colluded for years, starting in the mid-50s, on a number of different things, a number of different frauds, all involving the agriculture sector, where this guy Billy Solestis came from as a cotton farmer in West Texas. So in 1961, this Henry Marshall, and actually starting in 1960 and into 61, Henry Marshall was what they call an extension agent who worked for the Department of Agriculture, but in and around Waco, Texas. That is I guess it's called the Western District or whatever. And
it's kind of central Texas, yeah, very.
It's central or Western, but sometimes they call something Western, even though it's not necessarily in the West, like Waco is. But I'll get that's a whole other point. That the federal judicial system is actually constructed that way, actually. But anyway, so 1961 was the year that the Billy Solestis mess was starting to come about, and in 1962, it really hit the fan, because in 1962, I remember this because that's that was in every newspaper, every evening news. You couldn't get away from it. It was in news magazines, Life, Look, Collier's. It was everywhere. And it was very confusing to me because here I was, still a young man, trying to understand what was going on with this thing that my father warned me about. And it was,
it wasn't supposed to be tied to Johnson, right? So Sol Estes is independently, right.
Yeah, that's why I was trying to figure out how to get across, because Johnson's name was rarely mentioned in any of this, and that's what caused my confusion. Because otherwise, this was a thing that you might expect to be handled in Texas as a Texas issue, as a
state issue,
fraud, whatever, and the same thing might be going on in Iowa or Timbuktu as well. In other words, I couldn't understand what the national perspective was, because here it was. I was just graduating from high school, and we took a trip to Washington, D.C. in a bus. And when we all, during this time, I kept hearing on the radio and on the newspapers and all this about this guy, Billy Celestis, and the crimes that he was committing, and wondering why they're making a big deal about this all over the country. And it became evident because it was reported in these national magazines. Okay, it was. And that's where I got my information originally, and where it still exists. All of those stories are still out there if you go back and read those old magazines. Well, anyway, it finally was explained to me when in 1964 the book by J. Evans Haley came out and talked about all that.
And that was a bestseller too. I think you wrote it was sold 7.5 million copies. It's just a huge number.
Yeah. That's a huge number.
Maybe a smaller. I think it was some smaller publication. Let me see if I can pull that up.
Mm-hmm. Well, anyway, this first chapter basically explains all of that. The story of basically it's all about Clint Peoples, who was assigned the duty of fleshing this out and explaining it in a report back to his superior, whose name also actually was Garrison, but it was a different Garrison. And
that's the book right there on screen, right, Philip? Texan looks at Lyndon, the study in illegitimate power.
It was a little paperback, and he self-published that book in 1964, which is kind of an interesting thing.
Very unusual, rare.
It was probably one of the first self-published type books, but he couldn't get any other publishers to touch it for some reason.
Curious. Wonder why.
Well, and this is also the chapter where everything that all my discussions about how Johnson's one of his chief sycophants in Texas was a federal judge named H. Barefoot Sanders. Now, back in 1963, he was a U.S. attorney, and he later was appointed, actually by Jimmy Carter, to be a federal judge later on. But it was Johnson who got him started, and it was Johnson who he owed his whole career to. And so there was this relationship between them that got to be very close, and I took pains to go through this chapter within the book to detail all of that, all the machinations that went on, between Sanders from the time he was a U.S. attorney and then he was made. He actually went to Washington for a couple of years and worked in 1965, 66, 67. He was working directly, for Johnson. Well, he might have been in another department. That's all. Yeah, you're right there. It's all going to be on there. But he was with Johnson all this time, always not too far away, if not physically, at least, the ability to talk, all the time, back and forth. Well, it took many years for Clint Peoples to build his case against Johnson. But in 1984, after Billy Celestis was finally released from his second term in prison, he immediately came to Clint Peoples and volunteered to tell him everything he knew about what went on there in Texas during all that time. But starting with this homicide, I should getting ahead of myself. Clint Peoples' basic problem was that he had all these murders, but no one he could accuse of it, even though he suspected Johnson was behind all of it. But it had to start with the fact that they were all declared all these murders were either declared accidental or suicide. And so he couldn't touch it. He couldn't really investigate them aggressively. So anyway,
and wasn't Marshall's suicide? He suicided himself with 5 shots to his chest or something.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. He had been beaten up so badly that one of his eyeballs was hanging from the socket. That he was all banged up and bruised, and broken limbs and so forth. And he had taken a full hit out of the truck exhaust because they put Wasp put some kind of a hose up there and made him breathe carbon monoxide. And then when he was still alive and he heard a car off in the distance, evidently, then he decided he had to shoot him. So he took Marshall's own rifle and shot Marshall 5 times in the chest within a 4-inch circle, right over his heart. So nearly all of those would have been a fatal shot. It was such overkill. It was, and the whole thing was messy, the whole crime scene. And so that became part of Mac Wallace's legend. He was just a sloppy murderer and did just stupid things like drive up in a this car with Virginia tags. It seemed like he would have thought if he's going to do a murder out there, he ought to at least steal some Texas tags to put on his car just to confuse people or whatever.
And he ended up, Mac Wallace conveniently died in a car crash too later, right? So
he did, and that was a controversy too because a lot of people think that was a setup. It was not really a murder, and the Wallace lived on for decades in Las Vegas.
Interesting. Faked his own death.
That's all addressed in that blog we were just looking at, on the Joan Mellon.
So that's in that whole thing, reframing history.
Yes.
Is whether he faked his own death.
Yeah, that whole section, that last section has to do with that accident and the indications that it's very probable, very possible that Mac Wallace's own family, led by his father, is then still alive, that acting perhaps with LBJ's, help, basically to just send him off to Vegas under a new name, a new identity, and put a corpse in this wrecked car that magically appeared out there. There were no witnesses to this accident.
Wow, that's suspicious.
And so that's all out there, and in that blog, it's all explained. But, it's not the strangest thing that that I've written about, but it's one of them.
But it's strange. I mean, the whole situation of this history that's been covered up or isn't put together by the court historians is remarkable. That there's so much there. A lot of this stuff happened, and I think it's a predicate leading up to November 22nd, 1963. These are very important facts that are gone. Like that event that happened in Dallas, that cataclysmic event, didn't come out of nothing. It came from a history of corruption and subterfuge and deception that have been happening for decades, and this is all part of it.
One of the things about this book compared to the earlier book is that there's much more original research here throughout the book, basically, but in particularly this first chapter, because the reason the material in this chapter didn't appear in the first book is because it wasn't even released to the public until 2012. And my first book was originally done in 2010 and then updated and given to Skyhorse to publish in 2011. And then in 2012, things began to, come to fruition in Dallas. The Dallas Public Library had previously published probably about 95% of Clint Peoples' papers and documents and all the records related to him. However, there was a piece that he said could not be released. Originally, it was just going to be after he died, but then he went back and he changed the rules for Dallas Public Library to hold that until not only did he die, but his wife died and his daughter died. And the reason for that is because he was convinced that if it got released when Barefoot Sanders was still alive, when Barefoot Sanders would go in there and tear it up and dispose of it. Here was it. We're talking about Clint Peoples, the very distinguished, the very honored, one of the highest honored guys in history in the Texas Rangers.
Right.
Okay, and so compare the veracity of the two of them. Well, anyway, I just want to read a little piece of one of those documents that had been held by him at his wishes, so it did not get released in 2012. Now, Barefoot Sanders died in 2007 or 2008, and so he had to. Then it had to wait until his daughter died. Well, she died in 2012, and then it was released.
Gotcha.
So I had a researcher friend obtain these documents for me down in Dallas.
Okay.
And so those papers appeared in print for the first time with this book. I'm not even sure if anybody else has ever published them, but it's very important in relation to understanding what was going on there. And anyway, I'm just going to start here.
Please do.
They were talking about. He said that they had a meeting together and they discussed the facts that there wasn't any way that they could hush Henry Marshall up. He's talking about Cliff Carter, Lyndon Johnson, and Mac Wallace met in January of 1961. This was the day before the inauguration. Johnson had a little party at his house, and they went to the back patio, and it was snowy out and everything. And if you remember, it was very cold and snowy inauguration as well the next day. And they were out on the patio talking about all this. And it was at that meeting where they discussed the fact that there wasn't any way that they could hush Henry Marshall up. I'm reading now. Henry Marshall was blowing the whistle to the degree that it was going to involve every one of them, and they were all going to the penitentiary. That's what Estes told me. Again, this is Clint Peoples' words here that I'm speaking.
Understood.
They knew that Henry Marshall had arrangements made, and the 2 days before Henry Marshall was killed, I found a letter saying that he was going to Washington. He had a meeting of his people down there in Bryan or somewhere, and he was going to straighten it out the following Monday, but he never made it to Washington. He didn't make it any further than the ranch. Estes told me that Johnson said, quote, "Get him promoted, give him a big job in the agriculture department, get him out of there," end quote. So, Clint Peoples again. They tried it. They wrote him letters, but he turned them down. He wouldn't accept it. It's in my files. He wouldn't accept this promotion, you see. And so then, when this meeting came about, they all decided that, quote, "fat's in the fire," end quote. Then Estes said that Johnson said this, quote, "he has got to go," end quote. And I even made a release to the press that that's the way he told me. He didn't say that Johnson said kill him, assassinate him, or anything. He said he's got to go. He tried to transfer him. I got the evidence that they did. They tried to transfer him, but he wouldn't accept it. Offered him a big job in the agriculture department. He wouldn't accept it. That's physical evidence. So this concludes pretty well that all this stuff is right. That's one of numerous excerpts from Clint Peoples' private documents that he instructed could not be released until, well, I just said it, for certain years, and that's the reason it wasn't in the first book, because it relates back to that whole scene, that whole scandal that was going on, that relates directly into the JFK assassination. So I used it as an opportunity to catch up on that little piece, and then from then on, I went through subsequent chapters. And if you want, we can talk about some of that, but it's up to you.
Yeah. We got about 20 minutes. Let's go back.
Well, one of the things I talk about is in chapter 2, it's called Master of Manipulation. This chapter reviews Johnson's long history of lies and deceits, including how he recruited men who he knew could be manipulated to ensure that they would perpetuate his contrived legacy and guarantee that he would be portrayed as a hero in books and film forevermore. It also examines certain other authors, such as Robert Caro, and their ulterior purposes, as this excerpt shows. And this is an excerpt from the book on that point.
Okay.
Robert Caro's interpretation of how Johnson became vice president, one that had been contaminated by multiple Johnson lies from the start in 1960, is but one of the disturbing indications that Mr. Caro has backed off considerably from earlier assertions. A few others of lesser importance have been identified in this book to demonstrate that this was not just some aberration or an arbitrary choice made for the purpose of literary style or brevity. Perhaps they were the result of extended editorial license allowed to someone of Mr. Caro's impressive accomplishments. In every historical account of important events, admittedly, even this one, the mix of documented facts versus theoretical conjecture must be considered in evaluating the merits of the arguments presented. Unfortunately, unlike most of the chapters in Robert Caro's earlier works, the narrative of this seminal event, is built on a foundation constructed of unwarranted speculation. It is at odds with the contemporaneous recollections of the credible witnesses noted, and consonant only with the original lie perpetuated by the subject, Lyndon B. Johnson, known by all, thanks in no small measure to Mr. Caro himself, to be a chronic and pathological liar. Well, that sums up a chapter, and so we have several other chapters that go on other courses, and they touch on such things as his use of some of America's wealthiest, most influential men. And that one, and in that regard, the mention earlier of Lew Wasserman is just one of many from Hollywood.
Right.
So anyway, we talked about that point previously.
I mean, it is incredible. So he had all these connections. He was relying on people. He was shutting down certain shows. The Men Who Killed Kennedy, they got shut down, right? I think that guy you said, the producer of The Men Who Killed Kennedy, went back to England and stopped like doing his stuff. Like they got intimidated or something like that. So
yeah, he became a recluse. Nigel Turner.
Yeah,
no one even knows what happened to him. I mean,
he just made that, and that's a very influential movie. And you reference that throughout your book too, right? That documentary.
Oh yes. Actually, in the introductions, because it was that book that piqued my interest in the subject, because I had always had. I tried to keep up with things. I read books all along the way, but all during my 40 years in the corporate life, I had to put it on the shelf. There was too much going on in my family life and my business and life and so forth. A lot of traveling and what have you. And so I never really, had the the opportunity to get into it until after I'd retired. Well, thankfully, I retired when I was 58. That was in 2003. And that I started reading some more. And finally, by 2007, I decided I can't wait anymore for someone else to write this book because no one else has written it. And yet I felt the perspective that I had built over this whole 40 or 50 years of following this guy, that I had to do something about it. I had to get it on record, and so that's what I did. The thing is, I grew so much in understanding during that period that I sort of enveloped other things and a lot of other things into the study, for instance, of this attack on the USS Liberty you just mentioned.
Right. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because some people don't know that story and how it ties into LBJ.
Oh, sure. Well, as a matter of fact, in this book, the Colossus book, there are 2 chapters dedicated to that story. And basically, I believe I made a pretty strong argument that it was all a setup. That Lyndon Johnson decided in 1967, or in the years leading up to 67, that in order for him to win re-election in 1968, he had to make something happen because it wasn't going on. He was losing, on almost a daily basis. He was losing support of the people of the United States who had always wondered what this war was all about in Vietnam. I was one of them. That it was that they tried to portray it as being in the national interest, and I could never quite grasp that because didn't seem to be anything in my mind that would pertain to that. So they wanted to blame it on the communist expansion and so forth and so on, and like this was part of all that. Well, it wasn't. Didn't really have much to do with it, other than the fact that, Ho Chi Minh was a communist, but it was a civil war of a little. It was a third world. Actually, the LBJ used to call it a fourth world country,
right?
And with no discernible relation to the national interest of the United States of America. I still don't understand that, but I think that it was just another con job by him to get there.
Well, there was the whole Gulf of Tonkin incident, which was fake, which is important to put the liberty in context of that.
Yeah. Exactly. And that of course happened in 1964, and it allowed him in early 1965 to start the ramp up, and he continued that for the next 3 or 4 years and into the 500,000 men level. Those are 5,000 at a time, but the ones coming and going throughout that almost 10-year period is, it was more like 3 million people, 3 million men, and very few women, of course, had to deal with that. But 3 million American boys, can we just say that? They were like 18, 19, 20 years old.
Right, but it was a disaster for our country culturally, and for they talk about 50,000 dead, but there was wreckage of human beings coming back, and the U.S. slaughtered over 1 million people and displaced tons of people, bombed Laos. Oh, yeah. Right. Just horrible stuff happened in Vietnam under the auspices of LBJ.
Well, yeah, and it was all for a number of reasons. I mentioned one before. One of the reasons was he wanted to distract people from that little Dallas incident back there. He wanted them to be thinking about this and that and the other, including civil rights and this, and of course this whole litany of Great Society legislations. That explains all of that.
Right.
Distraction was the name of the game. It's all about what the magicians call sleight of hand.
There you go.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so the two chapters in the Colossus book examine that in considerable detail. However, it also explains, or it also put me in a position of deciding to write another book dedicated to nothing but the attack on the Liberty.
That was Remember the Liberty, Almost Sunk by Treason on the High Seas of 2017.
Correct. Right. That was published in 2017, the 50th anniversary of the attack.
Oh, faster.
And the attack was on June the 8th of 1967. And it was supposed to have been that. Well, let me reframe this a little bit.
Okay.
I document within the book that the planning for this, the supposed, spontaneous war, was nothing but, nothing of that. It actually, they started planning this in late 1964 and 65, because even in 1965, the military had already started putting advisors over in Israel to prep them in many aspects of this war that they had scheduled for June the 15th of 1967. Can you believe this? Yeah, they scheduled the actual start date of the spontaneous war to start on June 15th of 67 back in 65 or 66. That's how ridiculous that is.
But that's not what they put forward in the public. It's supposed to be a spontaneous war.
No. That was a secret. All this was secret.
Gotcha.
So anyway, the problem was there were a number of people who had put this plan together, both in the U.S., men who were worked directly for Lyndon Johnson, Walt Rostow being one, and McGeorge Bundy being another. But others, even the CIA guy, Helms, Richard Helms.
Richard Helms, yeah.
And boy, what a snake that guy was, But anyway, let's keep on subject here. Okay, William? It's me that does
There's a lot of subjects, though. I mean, the thing is that there's so many important events that happened under LBJ. It's just incredible.
Well, yeah. Well, the worst part of what happened is yet to come. I'll get to that, but let me try to approach it.
I've only got about 8 minutes, so we got to kind of speed it up.
Okay. Well, the long and short of it is that it was scheduled for June 15th, 1967. That was even in the operation. It was called Operation Cyanide. Johnson's piece of this. Okay, so I'm talking about Johnson's piece, not the entire 6 day what came out as a 6 day war. That was an Israeli primary operation, but Johnson's little piece that he stuck in there was called Operation Cyanide, and it was about sinking his own ship and taking 300 men to the bottom of the Mediterranean. Okay, he thought that doing that would give him the pretext to join Israel in this war and fight side by side with them to take out Nasser and Egypt, Abdul Gamal Nasser, and that was the plan anyway. But they were going to go ahead and attack the ship, but blame it on Egypt. Okay, and if they had sunk it and it would gone to the bottom of the sea immediately like it was supposed to, then they wouldn't have anything to explain. They wouldn't have anybody to ever question any of this story.
It was essential that it went to the bottom of the ocean.
Absolutely. Well, that didn't happen, and it was a lot of the survivors think it was divine intervention because there were just one miracle after another. It wasn't just one miracle; it was a series of what have to be sort of like miracles in order to understand what happened that caused the ship not to sink, but to be saved. Well, it did lose 34 men in the attack and 174 other men. Almost about 80% of the crew, that is, was either killed or injured. Okay, so what happened then is that after the attack, and all the men on board had no idea what this was about. They didn't even know who was attacking at first because all the fighter jets were repainted over to eliminate the Star of David and any indication it was Israel. So they all assumed it was Egypt. And because it happened so suddenly, and they had, they just had to react to what was going on. Well, after the attack, or during the attack, one of the sailors had to suddenly go out on the decks and rig a temporary antenna. There was an antenna that had to be attached to a coax cable for a transmitter. The only transmitter on board that didn't get blown up in the attack because it was out of order. So the heat-seeking missiles didn't find it. And so that allowed them the opportunity, only because this hero, the biggest hero of them all, his name was Terry Helbadir, I think it's pronounced, went out on the deck, took that coax, hooked it in, and they were able to get out an SOS call and to alert the Sixth Fleet, which is about 400 miles away, with 2 aircraft carriers, destroyers, all kinds of other support ships around it, to the fact that this attack was going on. So they immediately sent out fighter jets to come to its rescue. But they, after just leaving the decks of those aircraft carriers, just minutes later, they were all called back by Robert McNamara on the orders of Lyndon Johnson. And they couldn't, that is the Admiral Geese on the USS America on the Sixth Fleet, couldn't understand this. He said, what is this? We have a duty to help, save those guys. And they said, well, we have to get your fighter jets reconfigured because they suspected that there were nuclear bombs on board. Well, actually, there were 2 A-4 fighters or bombers that were headed for Cairo with nuclear bombs on them they were ordered to bomb Cairo.
Wow.
That would have been disastrous because the Egypt, also known as the United Arab Republics at that time, with Jordan and Syria, they were now aligned with the Soviet Union, and it was almost triggered, but for sure, a nuclear conflagration right over Bethlehem and Israel. It's just
crazy,
unbelievable the risk that he was. But at this point, he was psychotic. You have to understand that. You have to give him some credit here, or give him a little allowance, because he was mentally ill. He was going through psychotic episodes, and that's all documented throughout all my books. I have pages on all that point throughout each of them, because you can't lose sight of that. Everything he did had to be explained.
And I think you said that, like Bill Moyer said, people wouldn't believe what's going on in this White House and
Exactly.
all this stuff. Like, people were like, "This is unbelievable." And the interesting thing is, nobody really wants to tell the truth of what happened in the White House at that time. It seems like about Vietnam and about LBJ and how crazy he was. So.
Yeah, they had to basically shut the whole thing up, and the cover up that they put in was just unbelievable. All these guys who survived had to deal with it alone, because they were ordered to different spots around the world, so that no 2 of them could be together. They couldn't commiserate it amongst themselves. They were ordered not to discuss it at all with their mother, their father, their wife, nobody. That's who they could talk to. Nobody. They had to talk to themselves. And it drove them, a lot of them, to the brink, more or less. I mean, they all handled it very well, I'm saying, but it was a very, very stressful thing that you can hardly listen to them without coming to tears sometimes. Some of the stories that they had to live through this.
Right. No, it's unbelievable. It's incredible. The thing about this book and the last book we discussed is how great your research is. You've just got so much detail and references to certain times and dates that it's all backed up. This is not like, this is this is quality scholarship and research that people should be reading. So where should people get LBJ from Mastermind to the Colossus?
Well, all 4 of my books are featured on my website and blog called LBJ The Master of Deceit.com, of course.
All one word, LBJ The Master of Deceit.com.
Yeah, if you type in LBJ The Master of Deceit, probably with or without spaces, it'll pop up.
Right.
And so there's a section that describes in summary detail the gist of each of the 4 books.
Gotcha.
And then the blogs, as I said before, there are some blogs on there that I've done since those books were published that carry some of the same themes forward and develop more context for some of these events and people, and especially Clint Peoples. He really was a hero in many ways. Almost no one has heard of him, but he and his work, was really is what flipped this much of what we know about Johnson. I mean, without that,
without him, we wouldn't have the insight of the totality.
totality.
Because he was covering it all up. He knew he was actively covering up. I think you show in your book, he's got people in the right place. He's deliberately deceptive. He knows how to operate without leaving a trace as much as possible. So, really important for people to read these books.
Yeah, the order that these Navy guys got was you will not discuss this with anyone, or else, basically. But it was because you will be imprisoned or worse. Okay, it was the or worse thing. What's worse than prison?
Death.
Yeah, I guess that's the only thing I can think of.
All right, I got to run. Again, the title of the book is LBJ From Mastermind to Colossus with author Phillip F. Nelson, and I will put a link to your website in the show notes. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you, William. I appreciate it.
All right,